All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Revelation. In this recording, we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 through 17. And this section contains the opening of the first 6 of the 7 seals. And the 7 seals is really the first of 3 sequences like that in the book of Revelation. You have the 7 seals, then after that you have the 7 trumpets, and then a little later in the book you get the 7 bowls of wrath. And this scene here in chapter 6 flows directly out of the last one. So in the last one, John was caught up into heaven, right into God's throne room. And God was seated on his throne, and in his right hand he held a scroll that was sealed with 7 seals. And no one on earth or below the earth or above the earth, right in heaven, no one was able to open the scroll until the Lion of the tribe of Judah, God's appointed king, who actually appears as a slaughtered lamb, until he enters the throne room. And he comes right into the middle of the throne platform itself. And he now is worthy and has the authority to open the scroll that God himself is holding. The way Revelation chapter 5 puts it is, he is worthy to receive power and glory and honor, and thus be able to open this scroll. And so the Messiah, Jesus, glorified, the slaughtered lamb, takes the scroll from God's right hand, sits on the throne next to God, and now in chapter 6, we come to the moment that John has desperately been waiting for. Like, who can open this scroll? What's in that scroll? Well, we come to that moment that John's been waiting for, and really as readers, we have been waiting for too. What's in that scroll? And so here in chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, the scroll is opened one seal at a time. Now, that wouldn't work in ordinary life, but in visions and dreams, right? Things work differently. And so this scroll is opened one seal at a time. And what John sees seems to portray some of the kinds of things that have already been happening, as well as some of the things that are about to happen in the world of the original readers, things that are affecting the 7 churches of Asia, and also the kinds of things that have really continued to happen throughout all of history since John first wrote this book. And so Revelation chapter 6, verse 1 opens like this. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals. And remember, we're just flowing right out of the throne room scene where we saw the worship of God and of the Lamb that was happening in the heavenly throne room. And the Lamb, now seated on the throne, is going to open the seals on this scroll. And so he breaks the first seal and he opens the first part of the scroll. And John goes on and says, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice of thunder. And so you got to remember the setting of chapters 4 and 5, where you have God's throne in the center, and then right next to that you have the 4 living creatures, and then you have the rest of the participants in the drama there in the throne room around that. And so these are the 4 living creatures around the throne, and one of them says with a voice as loud as thunder, come. And I looked, John writes, and behold, a white horse, and the one who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. And so what we're going to see in these first 4 of the 7 seals as they're open, we're going to be introduced to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as they have famously been called. And this is the first one. And notice it's a horse and a rider, and he's riding a white horse. And what he portrays is conquest. He wears a crown, meaning he's a king and he has authority and power. He carries a bow, and he's going out to make conquest. Perhaps the fact that he's pictured on a white horse intends to communicate that he pretends to have noble and even good intentions. He's a messianic type pretender. And that's often the way it is with human conquest. Oh, we're going to go out, we're going to bring order and stability to the world. In fact, the Romans themselves, their propaganda machine said they brought order and peace and stability to the Mediterranean world by their conquest. And they did so with a ruthless military might. And that's sort of the picture we get with this white horse. He's a conqueror going out to conquer the world. That's the first seal. Verse 3, the second seal. When he broke the second seal, I heard the second of the four living creatures say, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out. And to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, that people would kill one another, and a large sword was given to him. This horse and rider portrays violence and war. He carries a large sword, which was the stock symbol of war in the ancient world, and he takes peace from the earth, and people are now killing one another. This is violence and war plaguing the world. And for the original audience, the seven churches of Asia, conquest and war, they were just the order of the day. That's how Rome got to where Rome was. That's how Rome ruled the Mediterranean world. They had conquered well to the east. They had conquered well to the west. In fact, they ruled the lands all the way beyond east of Jerusalem and Israel, and all the way out to Great Britain. They ruled all of that land, and they had won it by conquest and war. And interestingly enough, soldiers in the Roman military wore red dress, red clothing. And while the official propaganda of the day proclaimed peace, the famous Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, they maintained that by violence and death. Anything that threatened the peace of the empire, the stability and Roman control, was put down with massive military violence. And sadly, that has been the case all throughout history as well. After the second horseman, we get the third horseman, and very typically, the third horseman follows on the heels of conquest and war. So look at the third horseman in verse 5. And when he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and the one who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. What you need to picture is balance scales, the type of scale you put a weight on one side, and then you put food or some item of purchase that you buy by the pound on the other side, and you balance it out. So picture balance scales. It was the kind of thing that was used any time in the ancient world that you wanted to buy food in the market or elsewhere. And in this context of the third seal, it's actually going to picture rationing of food. So this rider on the black horse has scales in his hands, and here's what he's told. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, which probably refers to like the Lamb's voice or maybe God's voice, since the throne is in the center of the four living creatures. So I'm assuming that's who's speaking here. And he's told, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, but don't damage the oil and the wine. And now, wheat and barley were literally staples of the Greco-Roman diet, the staples of the diet for the people of the Mediterranean world. It was their daily bread. And wheat was considered superior to barley, so you could get more barley for less money than you could for wheat. And a denarius was the standard amount of a day's wage. And so what is described here by the amount of wheat you could get for a denarius and the amount of barley you could get for a denarius is this describes, portrays super expensive food. It's going to be really hard to buy enough food to put bread on the table for your family. In fact, scholars suggest that these prices described here in this part of the vision are somewhere between 8 to 16 times above normal rates for wheat and barley. In other words, we're talking serious inflation. In fact, this may actually play off of an event from the time of the Emperor Domitian, who is the most likely emperor when the book of Revelation is written. There was a grain shortage that was affecting the empire, and Domitian himself ordered half of the vineyards cut down throughout Asia. Don't damage the oil and the wine. That comes from vineyards, which often also had olive groves associated with them. So cut down half of the vineyards and replace with grain fields to try to solve the grain shortage. Now, thankfully, other people intervened and they stopped the order and brought some sanity to it, because that would have created whole other economic problems as well. And so maybe this plays off of that. Who knows? The point here is that in the wake of war and killing and conquest, now we have massive food shortages and inflation going on. And then in verse 7, we get the fourth seal. When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and behold, an ashen horse. That is a pale, kind of gray, pale, sickly colored horse. And the one who sat on it had the name Death. And Hades was following close behind. And so Death himself is now riding out on his horse, followed closely by his companion, Hades. In fact, towards the end of the book of Revelation, these two in the book of Revelation go together all the time. And at the end of the book, Death and Hades themselves are going to be thrown into the lake of fire. So they come riding out with the breaking of the fourth seal. And here's what it says: authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and famine and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. In other words, what we're picturing here and describing is death ravaging the world. You have sword, which means war and violence. You have famine, the food shortages, and people starving to death. Added to that here now is plague and even wild animals killing people. So you get plague and wild beasts are now instruments also of death's menace on the earth. And again, throughout history, this has just been the case. Disease and plague actually had devastated a huge portion of the population of the city of Rome itself about 30 years before the book of Revelation was written. About 30,000 people were killed by a plague in the year 65. We're familiar with in medieval Europe, where about a third of Europe was wiped out from the Black Death during the Middle Ages. Or even in my own country and throughout other parts of Europe and the world, the great influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919 took the lives of over 50 million people. We get plague and death. Even today, disease-ridden refugee camps take the lives of thousands and thousands every single year. So all of this with these four horsemen, this is all a dramatic presentation of the kinds of things that were impacting the original readers and would eventually, even in greater ways, impact the original readers. There are also the kinds of things that we too can expect in our world today. The four horsemen really are familiar pictures of troubles that happen just as part of life on this fallen, broken, evil world. You get conquest, you get war, you get economic woes, you get hunger, disease, and death. All of these things darken life on earth. In fact, in recent history here in my country, the last 5 to 7 years, we've seen fuel prices go up and they show no signs of going back down. Food prices currently have been up for several years. Our grocery bill is almost 50% higher than it was just 3 or 4 years ago. We read about new wars, new terror plots, and we long for peace on earth. We're confronted constantly by world hunger statistics and people lacking clean water and diseases ravaging populations on earth. All of these things are familiar troubles that are now pictured here by these four horsemen. But notice a little detail there in verse 8. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth, a quarter of the earth. That is, God is on his throne, and the Lamb is the one opening the seals, and they put limits on these things. 1/4 means it could be worse, far worse. Praise God for placing limits on how these things and how many of these things affect the earth at any given time. And yet, these kinds of struggles still afflict all people, Christians and non-Christians alike. It's just part of the peril of life on earth as we know it. In fact, Jesus said, "In this world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world." And so the Lamb is on his throne. He's in control, even over such terribly awful human evils, even to the point of putting limits on it. Now, that's the first four seals. We get the next two in the following few sequences of chapter 6. And so the next seal, seal number 5, reveals something completely different than what we've seen so far. So look at verse 9. When the Lamb broke the 5th seal, John says, I saw underneath the altar. that's a new piece of furniture in the throne room that we haven't been introduced to before. But now in this moment, there's an altar all of a sudden that's been rolled onto the stage in the throne room of heaven. And John sees underneath the altar, below apparently a giant massive altar now that's been brought into the drama, the souls of those who have been killed because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they have maintained. In other words, what John sees is people who have been executed because they've been faithful to Jesus, and they have been faithful to Jesus all the way to the point of death. In fact, the word testimony here is the Greek word from which we get the English word martyr. These people have lived faithfully for Jesus, even in the face of opposition, even in the face of suffering, and they have overcome. Just as the letters to the seven churches encourage the churches to do, he who overcomes, he who's victorious, right? Well, these people have. They've been faithful unto death. And John sees them now beneath the altar, somehow below the altar. And the picture almost seems to be like they're like sacrifices, like it's their blood that's been sprinkled on the altar. Their death is sort of like an offering to the Lord and an offering to God. And they cry out now for God to vindicate them in the hour of their death. And so verse 10 says, they, that is those, the souls of these who have been killed because of their faithfulness to Jesus, they cried out with a loud voice saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who live on the earth? In other words, they're crying out for God to act. Like, God, when are you going to act? When are you going to take matters into your hands and judge those who have put to death your faithful servants and your faithful ones and avenge our blood? The cry for vindication is a real cry. It shows up all over the Psalms. When you read through the Psalms, the righteous, that is God's people, cry out to God to act for those who are tormenting them, harming them, afflicting them in some ways. It shows up here, obviously, in this moment. You find it even in places like 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 4 through 7. Let me just read you what the Apostle Paul writes there. As a result, Paul writes in 2 Thessalonians 1, we ourselves speak proudly of you among the churches of God for your perseverance and faith in the midst of all your persecutions and afflictions which you endure. This is a plain indication of God's righteous judgment, so that you will be considered worthy of the kingdom of God, for which indeed you are suffering. For after all, it's only right for God to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to give relief to you who are afflicted along with us when the Lord Jesus will be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels. And that's the same cry. That's Paul says it's only right for God to do that. And that's what they're asking. God, will you rise up? Will you act? And will you avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And notice the cry is addressed to God, God who is holy and true, calling on him who is that to apply his holiness and his truth to what has gone on in the world. Notice they ask God to avenge our blood. That is calling on God to vindicate and make it right. In other words, they're not going to take matters into their own hands, but they're asking the just judge of all the earth to do what's right and to make things right. That's the cry. And so John sees these faithful ones who have now died or been killed, and they've been faithful unto death, and they're asking God to make things right. And here's how God responds to that. Verse 11, and a white robe was given to each of them. White robe probably picturing purity and righteousness, and maybe even just you've won. You have been victorious. So here's the robe of your victory and your righteousness. And so a white robe was given to each of them, and they were told that they were to rest for a little while longer. You just rest, just wait and rest until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters who were to be killed, even as they had been, was completed also. Notice the idea there that there's some sort of complete number that God knows. When that number is reached, when it's completed also, God knows that number, and there is a limit to it. And at some point, that end point will come. So you rest and you wait until God says enough's enough, and then God will act. And this is not a call so much for revenge as it is a call for justice. God, bring justice. Make it clear that we were in the right to put our faith in Jesus. Make it clear that they were wrong to oppose Jesus and therefore to oppose us. Bring justice, O God, and repay them for what they have done. And that's a deep-seated common human sentiment. We long for justice. Wrongs need to be righted. Injustices need to be set right. And we humans have an innate longing for that. I think we have an innate longing for that because we've been made in the image of God, right? And God is just, and therefore we're made for justice. And injustice and wrongs need to be set right. And that's their call. That's what they're crying out for, right? And it reminds us of what Paul wrote again in Romans chapter 12, verse 19, when he says, "Don't take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it's written, 'It's mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord." And so we wait, we trust in God to make things right. And that's what they're told. They're told, wait a little longer. When the time is right, God will do what he said he'll do. He will repay, and he'll set things right. And so rest and wait. And then after the fifth seal, we get seal number 6, which seems to picture judgment on the world and judgment on its rulers and all its people. In other words, okay, coming right out of seal number 5, this seal now pictures God's response. When enough's enough and when he reaches his endpoint, God will act. And here's a picture of that just judgment where God does act. And it culminates with a question here in seal number 6, who can stand? Pay attention to that question, because that question is going to be the question that's answered in Revelation chapter 7. And so seal number 6 says this, "And I looked, when he broke the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became as black as sackcloth made of goat's hair." In fact, we talked about it when we talked through the letters to the 7 churches, that some of these cities were famous for their dark black goat hair fabric, right? Well, the sky and the sun became black like that, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, just like what happens as a fig tree drops its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. And then the sky was split apart like a scroll and is rolled back up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. And all of this is language that comes out of places in the Old Testament, particularly the Old Testament prophets, where they talked about judgment. They talked about God acting. Now here, all compiled together into one place. And so it's a portrayal of God acting and judgment coming upon the earth. And then we get the response of the people on earth. Look at verse 15. "Then the kings of the earth and the eminent people," that is the great and high people, "and the commanders and the wealthy and the strong." So that's a listing of all the wealthy and powerful and important and people who, nothing bad's ever going to happen to them. We have that listing, but then we get every slave and free person. In other words, the whole gamut of humanity hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. In other words, all different kinds of people, all different classes of people, they're all hiding. And here's what they said. They said to the mountains and to the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. Who is able to stand?" Notice how this is described as the great day of their wrath. Throughout Revelation, this is used for the final climactic events of God's judgment. And so in this first sequence of the 7 seals, up to this point, the 6th seal, what we get is a dramatic presentation of what's happening in their world and what will happen through the world all the way up until the great day of God's wrath comes, which seems then to be, all right, this is stuff happening in the world of the original readers, but it's stuff that's going to happen clear up until God says enough is enough, and the final climactic great day of God's wrath comes. And then you get that question at the end, who is able to stand before the great day of God's wrath? Well, chapter 7 is about to answer that question. Who can stand? And what chapter 7 will say and answer is those marked by God, those who have been washed in the blood of the Lamb. Those ones, and only those ones, are the people who can stand before the wrath of the Lamb on the great day that their wrath come. So that's seals 1 through 6. We'll get the seventh seal at the beginning of chapter 8 after the brief interlude in chapter 7. And yet most of the action, really all of the action of the vision of the seven seals is completed by the time we get through seal number 6. And so before we leave this vision, let me just offer a brief reflection. Sometimes when we read the news, it's easy to feel like the world is spiraling out of control. You ever felt that way? I know I have. Maybe you feel that way right now and you're wondering what is going on? Where is it all going to end up? What's the world going to be like for my kids or my grandkids? And one of the major points of this section, of this vision, is that even in the midst of all the chaos of this world, things like war and conquest and violence and famine and hunger, right, and disease and death, in the midst of all of that chaos in this world, the Lamb is in charge. He's the one opening the scrolls. He's the one in charge of history. In fact, his servants, the angels, are saying, come, and these war and conquest and all these things are emerging. And so the Lamb is in charge. He even sets limits on it. A fourth of the earth is what's going to be affected here. And so that's the limit on how much damage can be done. And so as you read this section of Revelation, here's some questions to reflect on. What impression does it make on you that God is sovereign over these kinds of things? What encouragement does it provide to you that God is sovereign over these kinds of things? What encouragement does it provide to you that these realities were things that John, through this vision, was warning his churches of there in Asia Minor? And what does that mean for us today who still experience these same sorts of things? And what does it provide, or what encouragement does it provide for you to hear the faithful ones under the altar cry out, God, when are you going to act? And then to see in the very next moment of the vision, God acts in the great day of his wrath, that there will come a day when God makes things right, when God vindicates his people. How does that help you to be faithful unto the point of death through whatever you encounter for your faith and faithfulness to Jesus right now? All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So let me just say thanks a ton for your support, for making this possible. God is bearing good fruit in the lives of people all around the world through the commentary because of your generosity. So thanks a ton for that. And if you have been encouraged, challenged, blessed by the Listener's Commentary, could I just ask you to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters so that this ministry could continue to grow and expand and reach more people with clear, down-to-earth Bible teaching that can help them learn and live the Bible? If you want to do that, the easiest way to join the team of supporters is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and it'll redirect you to a page, my page, through World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit, where you can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it monthly, there's a little box you got to check before you do anything else that says make this monthly. And you can set up a monthly or a one-time donation right there. Thanks a ton for your support.